In 2026, the Disclosure Forum featured a congressional roundtable on UAP transparency, a scientific investigation panel, and a panel on the security threats presented by UAPs. Here to discuss more is Professor Avi Loeb, who you've seen on Rising a ton, and I'll call you an expert in all of this. How was today?
Well, thanks for having me. I would say what is unusual about this subject is that it brings together people from both parties, and they
Yes.
really resonate with it. Because if there is a knock on the door by a neighbor, we all live in the same house, so to speak, and we should cooperate trying to figure out what it means to our future. So that's why everyone is excited. But there is another aspect to it, and that's why I'm happy to serve as an advisor to government on this matter. And that is the most down-to-earth interpretation of these objects is that they're human-made, right? So if they're technological and human-made, we're facing a breach of national security because some of them are hovering above strategic sites, and the Pentagon is unable to tell where they came from.
Wow.
So in that sense, it's a serious matter, and there needs to be more research going into figuring out what these objects are. They are definitely real, and the director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office in the Pentagon released in the latest batch of released documents, he released a report where he's talking about an event back in October 2023 where law enforcement officials noticed orbs that behave in very strange ways. And the phenomena, 40% of these phenomena were not resolved. And I would have expected such a report to go as a classified memo to Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, rather than displayed to the public, because if it is adversarial nations, then we shouldn't know about it, because then it shows the vulnerability of the defense system of the US. And the fact that it was made public, and the same week I was asked to lead a advisory council that considers the science of unidentified anomalous phenomena, indicates to me that the government does not feel that it's a threat to national security necessarily, these objects, but we still need to figure them out, and I'm here to serve. So for me, it's a win-win situation, because either we will figure out and help the Pentagon accomplish its mission if it's human-made. That's exactly what their job definition is. But if it turns out that 1 out of a million, even just one object happens to be non-human made, it's the biggest discovery ever made for humanity, and it will change our future.
I love how practical and pragmatic you always are around the topic that could be hysterical for some people, right? People were looking for little green men to come out of the reports that were released recently by the government. But your approach seems to, you don't isolate people that might feel that way, but you want to explain it really in layman's terms. And so what were some key insights that you think happened today?
Yeah, it's really important to separate science fiction from science.
Yeah.
In the sense that Steven Spielberg released his latest film, Disclosure Day, on June 12th, when the latest tranche of documents was released by the US government. That was a real disclosure day. And the difference between Spielberg's script is that in his case, the hero that knows about the information that is about to be disclosed gets their car smashed against a moving train, whereas in my case, the government wants to cooperate, which is much better. And also, in science fiction, Spielberg doesn't have an obligation to be constrained by the laws of physics. He has artistic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, things only happen if they're consistent with the way nature is. And I find that far more inspiring, actually. And so it's really my hope that we will be able to encourage the government to look into aspects of these phenomena that will unravel its nature, just like a detective story where you want to collect enough clues so that everyone will be on the same page. It will be clear what really happens. And the way to do that is, of course, not only by analyzing past reports, but getting new data. And with respect to past reports, there is some information that was redacted, some that was not released as of yet. So we just requested more information, more than 50 items in the latest document that I submitted, there is a UAP governing board that we are reporting to, but we are dealing only with unclassified information, which is a great benefit because then we can communicate in a transparent way with the public, with the scientific community, and then everyone can see how we arrived at our conclusions, what kind of analysis we did. So it will be a much better process of figuring out what this thing is. And it's basically driven by curiosity and also an attempt to help government do its job of protecting the nation.
Why do you think there's been such a reluctance in transparency, knowing that there's bipartisan support for more transparency here and knowing that the American public wants some information?
It's really simple. Well, first, there is data collected by classified censors, and if that data were to be revealed publicly, adversarial nations will be aware of the capabilities of the US censors. So that's one reason. But there is a deeper reason, which is, if you were to work in the Pentagon or the intelligence agencies, you wouldn't want people to know that you're not doing your job. So, the defense budget is close to $1 trillion in 2026, and yet there are objects in the sky above strategic assets, and that the Pentagon cannot figure out. So that's not good news. And one way to not to get any scrutiny from Congress or the public is to classify this data. Then you can put it aside. You say, I don't understand it, but it's not really a national security threat because these things are not doing anything that we know of, except every now and then you see a Chinese spy balloon and you shoot it down. My claim is when you find an ant in the kitchen, then you get alarmed because there must be many more ants that are hidden from view, right? Mm-hmm. So if we shoot down one Chinese spy balloon, it means there are maybe thousands of drones over the US that are spying for adversarial nations, or maybe even more. So we need to keep our eyes on the orbs. There are these orbs that we don't know what they are, rather than pay attention to the audience, which is the opinions you see on social media, the discussions by politicians about it. This is completely irrelevant. We're dealing with physical objects, and we can figure them out if we get good enough data. If we get a high resolution image, if we measure their speed, acceleration, we can tell whether they are human-made or not.
What have you gathered from some of the releases that we've seen so far? Is there anything that specifically stuck out to you as something to either be alarmed by or have a reaction to or want to know way more about?
Well, I would like to know whether the orbs that are reported in many of these documents and videos, whether they are drones of some advanced technology that an adversarial nation has. And frankly, that would be my first assumption. But I actually had a brief conversation with General Petraeus yesterday, and he, I asked him, "Do you think it's human-made?" And he wasn't sure, and he said, "Well, some of the behavior that is reported cannot be easily understood." Okay, so I think there is sincerity in the way that we hear about it, that the government is unable to figure it out. That's why they're asking a scientist like myself to help. And I'm really happy to serve in that capacity because as an American citizen, I think that my duty as a scientist is to promote the security of the nation, but maybe government made the cosmic discovery. They made it before. The Vela satellites that were put in place to see if the Russians are cheating, if they have nuclear explosions above the atmosphere back in the 1960s. In 1967, they detected a gamma ray flash, and then a dozen more, 16 more actually, in the years after that. And they realized, these are flashes of gamma rays coming from the universe. And turns out these are the signals coming from the collapse of massive stars to a black hole. And so they discovered the formation process of black holes at the edge of the universe, just monitoring for national security, for gamma ray flashes. And the government also monitors for any flashes, infrared flashes coming from ballistic missile launches. There is a suite of satellites orbiting the Earth monitoring for that. But in the process of doing that, they see every now and then the fireball from a meteor, an object colliding with Earth and burning up in the atmosphere. And some of those happen to come from outside the solar system. And I was involved in the discovery of those in the catalog that the US government released through NASA. So what I'm trying to say is that in the process of developing the best sensors in the world for national security purposes, it's possible that the government will make the biggest discovery in science.
Yeah.
And so let's look at the data.
What exact laws, if any, are you pushing for? Do you want there to be laws on the books to make it almost mandated that this information is handed over to people that are experts in this field?
I think it's important for national security, and that should be enough, actually, to get deeper into the nature of these objects. And once we get enough information and we see something behaving in ways that are outside the performance envelope of human-made technologies, we'll have no choice but to admit that. In the situation that is available right now there is this ambiguity. Maybe someone in government knows, maybe there is data that we haven't seen, I haven't seen, but it's not a healthy situation. You want to, as a realist, you want to know what kind of an environment we live in, what is our neighborhood. And it makes no sense at all to hide the existence of a neighbor from our family members, because one day the neighbor will be observed by someone else. It was just like the Vatican putting Galileo in house arrest with the hope that nobody would know that we're not at the center of the universe. Then in 1992, they admitted that Galileo was right. They had no choice because there were spacecraft looking at Earth, moving around the sun. I mean, nobody can deny. So once there is good enough data, even an organization as powerful as the Vatican had to admit that they were wrong. And by the way, there is an interesting lesson there. Nobody put the bureaucrats of the Vatican or the Pope in jail because they made a cosmic blunder. So there shouldn't be any fear on behalf of government that, we thought that this is nothing significant. We didn't release the data to the public, and now it's released. I think once such information is released, everyone will be focused on the consequences of that for the future rather than wondering.
Looking backward.
Yeah, exactly.
And trying to see who to put in jail.
Yeah.
That's something that our government does way too much of. I want to talk about one of the topics that was discussed at the event, religious and societal implications of UAPs and UFO disclosure. What were some of the key takeaways from that part of the conversation?
Well, there was a discussion about whether Christianity or religion in general has an issue with that. And my personal take on this is that to believe that God is a parent that can attend to only one child is a very limited view, because God should be very capable, right? So we might have siblings in our family of intelligent civilizations. I don't see any contradiction. And in fact, it will bring people to a deeper sense of awe if they are religious, because some of these siblings may be more accomplished than we are. If you just read the news every day, you get disappointed. Oh, that's the best that God could have done.
Okay, I hear you. I talk about it every day, so I understand. But don't you think there'll be a little fear surrounding that if we do find out there's life out there? Is there maybe a reason that the government doesn't want mass hysteria?
Oh, okay, yes. So when you go on a blind date, you never know if you're meeting a friendly partner or maybe a serial killer, of course. But in this case, whoever is visiting us had plenty of time to kill us by now. Okay, there were better opportunities than right now because we're developing technologies. Before that, we didn't have so I'm not worried about that. It doesn't seem like we are being threatened. And by the way, if we were, I think it would unite all humans on Earth, because we would feel that we need to cooperate to mitigate that risk and protect the Earth. So it may have good consequences that the world will be more peaceful because everyone is in the same boat,
Right.
But I don't think we should worry about that. And but I do think that the scientific community right now, the astronomy community, is completely locked on a search for microbes. These are the lowest life forms. And when you go on a date, my philosophy was, before I met my wife, to always look for, to aim higher, not lower. In other words, look for someone more intelligent than I am, rather than for the most common and mediocre dating partner. And there are many of those. So when astronomer fellows, colleagues say we need to invest more than $10 billion in the search for microbes by looking for the chemical fingerprints. I say let's invest comparable sums of money, not only in the search for microbes, but also in the search for technological signatures of more intelligent civilizations, more accomplished than we are, because that would have a huge impact on our future if we find it. And also because the public cares so much about it. I mean, there were 1 billion views of the tranches of released files, within a matter of weeks. It just shows you how viral this interest is. And so science should serve the public because the public funds science through taxes. So my point is, it's a no-brainer. Obviously, we should invest in research related to technological signatures of intelligent civilizations. My colleagues disagree and they sideline that. But, we have been searching for radio signals so far for 67 years or so. But it's just like waiting for a phone call if you are waiting for a radio signal. Whereas I'm suggesting, let's check our mailbox. Maybe there is a package there. That's a very different search method for a neighbor. Maybe there are objects, physical objects in our backyard, like a tennis ball thrown by a neighbor. That's a different approach that was never looked into. And now the government tells us, we have some unusual data about it.
Well, we have to leave it there because you're a popular guy. A lot of people want to talk to you in DC. But Professor Avi Loeb, I can't wait to have you back on Rising and hear all about the next steps after what happened today.
Thank you so much. And I hope to visit many times.